If we could keep in that time period, and I want to get into the Kennedy brothers. From my understanding, America was at a crossroads at that time period. I think there was a time where I suppose the deep state of its day could have been stopped. It was so much potential for, I suppose, positive Americanism to flourish. We had a young, very intelligent president in the White House, but obviously things went bad with his assassination. There was also a potential for it to recover with the potential presidency of his brother, Robert, but that also was literally shot down. Also, if we could start with those two, what do you see with the Kennedy brothers and what they potential could have achieved and their role in history?
Yeah, so that's a great starting question. And it's somewhat painful to think what a different world we would be living in had these two great men who had really developed their minds and morals and identities to a very high degree had they not been cut down at their prime. Um, I think it's always more valuable to look at the policies because a lot of people they get like sucked into the question of like who killed JFK, what were the different, teams deployed that conducted a triangulated kill, and there's like obviously forensic evidence that posit that there's something like 12 or 13 bullets that we know of directly. It wasn't just obviously a lone gunman who was simply a disposable operative who was tied to the CIA, Lee Harvey Oswald, who had his own handlers. There's obviously a higher picture, but it's more valuable to look at, well, what was JFK? What were his policies? What was his vision? What was the paradigm that he was invested in, as was his brother? And you could read his outline for his new frontiers. You could look at the policies on banking, on resolving the problems of the Cold War, which he had a very strong strategic idea of not just simply having a balance of terror, the way many of these, freaks around Allen Dulles and within the U.S. military around Lyman Lebnitzer and the Joint Chiefs, who all viewed, they were all sort of the jarhead warhawks who had looked at the world in a very zero-sum fashion. JFK didn't think in a zero-sum term. He made accolades, especially coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, to Khrushchev, to his various counterparts in Russia for ending the Cold War by developing a joint space program. We can see the videos online of JFK making the offer at the United Nations in 1963 in October, right a month before he's killed, to the Soviet side, saying, let's jointly work together on sharing new scientific and technological progress, finding new points of common ground that involve mankind as a species exploring the stars together. That was a very potent idea, and that was one of many such policies that he was thinking about. He was also an anti-Malthusian. So one thing to keep in mind is that around the time of his victory in 1960, and he was made president in early 61, you had the emergence of things like the Morgues Manifesto, the World Wildlife Fund for Nature, founded by Prince Bernhard and Prince Philip and Julian Huxley, who together, and Julian Huxley was the co-author or the main author of the Morgues Manifesto, that called for a new ethos for mankind that would put the value upon preserving nature from the poison of human industrial activity instead of the former obsolete ethos, which they directly attack these individuals who the old obsolete ethos being the idea that human beings must be protected from empires. That was the old idea, and the idea of scientific and technological progress being something that is vitally important to emancipate humankind's and give meaning to the political independence movements. That was something that had to be crushed. JFK didn't like that. He actually spoke directly against Malthus and made a point in several speeches that I've read, and I've cited several in my book series, that Malthus's theories were based upon his own limited creativity and the system of empire that Malthus himself was a devotee of. He worked obviously as an economist for the British East India Company's Hailbury College. So JFK had a very strong sensibilities, which is why when you look at his economic policies, both for domestically, for within America's borders, but also internationally, they were very anti-Malthusian. He was trying to utilize the nation's resources, which at the time still were very much based upon a pro-industrial outlook. That it took many more years for that to be taken down under the post 1970 period, which I think we're going to talk about later. And he mobilized the United States both for building some of the biggest dams, hydroelectric dams, the water diversion projects of the 1960s under his lead that were initiated are record breaking. The creation of new arable land from desert land of the California zone, which is, I mean, one of the biggest. The state of California alone has 39 million people. It's more than the total amount of people in Canada. And the reason why is because you had these types of programs, first begun by Franklin Roosevelt, like the Imperial Valley program that turned the Imperial Valley from desert into one of the primary food growing regions of the world. And JFK really revitalized this in a massive way. And standards of living increased, everything else. Now, he also was looking towards Kwame Nkrumah, a Pan-African leader of Ghana, who was very close friends, was actually, I think, the first foreign head of state to the White House, who JFK had met with and had helped build the Akosombo Dam on the Volta River, which today has a plaque dedicated to JFK. It was the biggest hydroelectric dam project in the world. This entire thing was opposed by the J.P. Morgan United Steel operations, which were always trying to undercut and undermine JFK's pro-development outlook, including in Africa. He had similar projects for his counterparts in Latin America, in Asia. So he was on a rampage, pushing for full spectrum economic development to former colonized peoples. Patrice Lumumba had been killed right before he entered, but JFK was very much looking forward to collaborating with Patrice Lumumba of Congo. And it really broke JFK's heart. I think it was 3 days before he was brought in as president that he found out that the CIA had killed Lumumba. He had counterparts with Gamal Nasser as well of Egypt, who had a very similar anti-imperial spirit. So it wasn't just him. There was a whole network of anti-Malthusian statesmen who were willing to give their lives in opposition to this death cult emerging around what it was that Julian, Huxley, Prince Bernhard, Prince Philip had put online. Which, keep in mind, these creatures who were in opposition to JFK's outlook, were themselves eugenicists, devotees of Thomas Malthus. They were themselves supporters, in the case of Prince Bernhard, very openly and directly, the rise of Hitler in the 1930s. He was a member of, I don't know if he was a member of Hitler's SS, but he was certainly a high-level Nazi official, Prince Bernhard, before he ended up organizing the creation of the Bilderberger groups in 1954. So all of these characters are anti-humanists representing the inner echelons of the old nobility, the old bloodlines of Europe, who are all trying to bring about a new ethic for humankind. So it took the dead bodies of JFK, his brother. When you read Bobby Kennedy's, who at the time was district attorney of the United States under his brother, after John F. Kennedy was killed, he found himself increasingly as a solo operator, and he left to rejoin the Senate at a certain point when it became too unmanageable under the conditions that were being put into motion by Lyndon Johnson, who had said that he was, at his last interview on his ranch, he had said that he believed that the rifles, plural, that had killed JFK were always pointed to the back of his neck at all times. So he was kind of like a president and hostage in a sense, who didn't really do very much good. We know that JFK also would have ended the Vietnam War debacle, the quagmire. He had taken the advice of people like Eisenhower and de Gaulle, who had given him strong advice, which he followed through on, and had a bill that he had introduced, an SSM. I forget which number it is, to basically start extracting U.S. Advisors from Vietnam with a full withdrawal of all troops and all advisors within the year. That obviously was not acted upon after he died. Bobby Kennedy, in his Towards a Newer World, a small booklet that outlined his policy reforms, he also called for reforming the CIA, which his brother John had, threatened to break into 1,000 pieces after firing Allen Dulles, as well as Cabell and another high official at the CIA. So Bobby Kennedy was also looking at the same thing. He was also looking at reviving all of the best attributes of the JFK policy, undoing the quagmire of Vietnam in 1968, we're talking here. And he certainly would have won. He would have been victorious. There was no real resistance in the Democratic candidate, in any other Democratic candidate. And unfortunately, he was killed in 68, as everyone knows, a few months after Martin Luther King Jr. was killed, who he was working increasingly very close with, which is, I think, why there's been an increased effort by the part of the historical narrative makers in our recent or our modern age to try to paint Bobby Kennedy as if he was the nemesis of MLK, who hated MLK and wanted to work with. This is something we're getting a lot in the mainstream media and CFR connected historians who are all pumping this idea. Like even Jim Comey had said, he keeps the document that was approved by Bobby Kennedy to conduct surveillance by the FBI on Martin Luther King on his desk at all times in order to remind him of the abuse, corruption, and misuse of the high office of the FBI, so that he would always stay on the straight and narrow path. He, of course, said this right before Donald Trump fired him. Now, that's an irony of history as well. But all that to say, JFK and Bobby were very close allies, especially in 66, 67, 68. It peaked. And there's no reason to think that a likely JFK, Martin Luther King presidency, vice presidency could not have happened, because that was also being discussed.
You mean RFK? You mean RFK?
I said Bobby, yeah, Robert Bobby F. Kennedy.
Yeah. Really? Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King.
Yeah, Cynthia McKinney has given a variety of presentations. She's written about her own research into the archives, looking at the source letters and correspondences between the two gentlemen.
Wow, I never heard of that. Wow. Mm-hmm. Okay, I won't be surprised if Martin Luther King ended up running for president. Don't know if he'll win or not, but at least making a run for it. I think that was very likely. But I never knew that he would actually considering doing it with RFK. That's news to me. Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it blew my mind too. It was originally former Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney had delivered a lecture in Montreal that I had heard in 2011 for the first time. That was when I encountered it, and when I started scratching on that a few years later for an article in defense of Martin Luther King that I wrote and published for Strategic Culture, I had to scratch on that a little bit more. And sure enough, there's a bounty of points of evidence that demonstrate this to be true, and archival letters do exist that showcase this. I think Martin Luther King was still in a pensive place, but the proposition had been floated. He was certainly collaborating with Bobby. It would have been likely at some point that this happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, keeping on that time period, it's really, I see a real sad moment, almost an insult to injury, with you have LBJ being one of the most racist, pro-establishment type of guys you could ever have. He goes down in history with a landslide victory in the presidential, election. JFK hated him. Goldwater hated him. Yet Goldwater. I'm actually a big. I don't know how you feel about him, but I was actually a big fan of him too.
I like Barry Goldwater.
Oh, great. But he gets politically assassinated being this warmonger and nut job and racist because he opposed the 64 Civil Rights Act. And you get it's almost an inversion of these people where LBJ is the racist and the imperialist and the pro-establishment guy, yet he gets the landslide victory and gets seen as the civil rights champion. in regards to him saying, I always felt that I had I was in the crosshairs. I, not to get too sidetracked into the whole Kennedy assassination thing, but I always felt that he wasn't behind it, but he was part of it. And
Possible.
if he strayed, they had no problem taking him out too. So
Yeah, I mean, that's how I see it too. I don't see it as like because there's several major explanatory models of the JFK kill. One of which place him at the center command structure of a bunch of Texas oil barons who killed them. Obviously, he had his reasons to be happy to take the position, and I believe he was in the know. He was morally and intellectually a very mediocre little man. The best thing that could be said for him is that at a certain point he chose to give to populist pressure to pass the Civil Rights Act when he did. That's probably the best thing that could be said about him. And he didn't completely cancel NASA, although he did begin the process of gutting NASA. It peaked, the funding for NASA peaked in 1965, and it went down and down and down every year since. So he, yeah, was again too morally small and too intellectually mediocre to be at the center command of anything. I think he knew where his handlers would feed him, and he was willing to go along to a very high degree with his commands. But yeah, he didn't plan anything. He was a little puppet shill the whole time. And I do think that he probably had like a little mini voice of conscience scratching away at him. And at certain moments, he probably was afraid. He probably had his moments of, well, do I do it this way or do I risk getting my head blown off too? He probably had a few of those moments. And I think he was true. Like he told the truth. I think when he gave his last interview before he died, and he knew he was going to die on his ranch. And I read it, and he talks about the CIA base in the Caribbeans that he presumed was at the heart of the kill of JFK. And looking at my research and my wife's research, she's also done some great work on this stuff. And looking at the writing of Jim Garrison and Jim Garrison's research on the Trail of the Assassins, published in 1990, it does seem like that there was a certain Caribbean basing of the CIA that was tied to another organization by the name of Permindex, Permanent Industrial Exposition, that did have a coordinating role at carrying not only out the kill of JFK, but also, as we talked about last time we had a chat, you and I, at least two of the attempted 30 assassination attempts on de Gaulle. It also had a lot of overlap, it seems, with Operation Gladio, which was run out of NATO offices at the time still in France, but soon to be found in Brussels after de Gaulle kicked them out of France. But Operation Gladio involved the utilization of a lot of these Nazis, like these German high-level SS operatives and Italian fascists who were deployed to carry out targeted hits of statesmen that were troublesome to the oligarchy, as well as general terrorist cells of useful idiots and Maoist Leninists, white collar fool students who would become parts of things like the Weather Underground or the FLQ of Quebec or the Red Brigades of Italy and stuff. So yeah, it was all very, very enmeshed in one operation.
Right. Yeah, because I was, I remember hearing with LBJ when he retired to his ranch. I get the feeling that he was kind of haunted by his decisions in life. Like, I think he went to his ranch. Doctors were saying to him, like, stop eating, stop smoking, you're going to kill yourself. And I think he went on a self-destructive way where he ate even more and drank even more, and he grew his hair out, and he just didn't care anymore. And
I think he was haunted by conscience, and I think
yeah,
ultimately probably committed suicide in that sense. Like his lifestyle choices indicate to
yeah.
me that he wanted out. Yeah.
One of his quotes, I think he said something along the lines of, I chased power my whole life, and when I finally got it, it tasted like ash. Or he said something along those lines. So I think it was very
Powerful.
reflective. very reflective in his life of trying to become president, trying to do anything, go along with anything, and now look at me,
He
um,
sounds kind of like a bit of a Macbeth type of Shakespearean character, one of these low-level personalities who gets in way over their head, and they start just compromising and compromising until the point that they're living in blood, sitting in
yeah,
blood, and they've sold their
themselves,
soul, and they're living in their own personal hell at a certain
yeah,
point, and they self-destruct.
yeah, I think so. But keeping with the Kennedy brothers, one thing I noticed that JFK and Robert, they seem to be the ones on the, I suppose, fighting the good fight. But Ted Kennedy, he's the one that seemed to have, I think, end up joining. Like, I think maybe initially he was with them, with the two brothers, but after what happened to the both of them, and even he was nearly died in I think, in the airplane crash when he was younger, and everything else. I think he ended up going, listen, I saw what happened. You guys win. Don't kill me.
Yeah, he gave up. He totally gave
Uh,
in to the devil.
I'll
Yeah,
join
I
you.
think you're right, and I believe he had a lot of good in him, and I listened to a recording of the eulogy that he had delivered publicly upon the death of Bobby Kennedy, and it was one of the most poetic, heart-wrenching eulogies I'd ever heard. It implied a lot of strength and goodness in that young man, and something like you said along the way. The murders of his obviously of his brothers were a big sign. It broke him. It broke his will to stand by his conscience, and he chose to just play the game instead. And he ended up working with some of the worst insidious creeps for throughout the 1970s, 80s. And as far as I know, he might have done some good things now and again. I don't even know what those might be. I don't think he was evil, but he lost a lot. He gave up.
When he ran for president, or tried to in for the 1980 election, he challenged Jimmy Carter. But and also there was talk about him potentially running in '84 against Reagan. The family convinced him not to for obvious reasons. What do you think that kind of matchup would have been? A Kennedy versus a Reagan?
I don't know. I'd read a Valediction, a book by Paul and Elizabeth Fitzgerald Gould. Um, and in that book, they recount they're the two journalists, the only two American journalists who were permitted entry into Afghanistan during a period of total exclusion of all Western journalists for the two beginning years of the Soviets being sucked into the quagmire. Anyway, they had a lot of very interesting connections in the late 70s and early 80s, and one of those connections involved somebody who I believe was the chief of staff of Ted Kennedy, who they had met with, and that was right at the lead up of the 1980 election. And he had made a pledge that upon Ted Kennedy's victory, he would immediately open the books to the actual government-sponsored murder of his brothers, and he had targeted J. Edgar Hoover explicitly in this program, and they had this recounted to them by this chief of staff, and unfortunately, about a week, 7 days to the day after this conversation that they were privy to, one of this individual, this chief of staff, whose name is escaping me, he was a teacher, and one of his students, for some reason, just decided that particular day to walk into his office and shoot the guy to blow his face off, which he did. And this chief of staff died, and the student just sort of put his gun down, sat on the teacher's desk or the chief of staff's desk, and just waited for the cops to come and arrest him. He was sort of like in a bit of a trance-like state, apparently, as far as the cops had described his state of mind. That undoubtedly was a message again communicated, I'm sure, to Ted Kennedy, which he took to heart and didn't really bring it up again.